I'm sure that many of you, I hope, have seen this headline that came out a month or two ago. DEA agents had sex parties with prostitutes, Watchdog says, that reads, agents of the Drug Enforcement Administration reportedly had sex parties with prostitutes hired by drug cartels in Colombia, according to a new Inspector General report released by the Justice Department on Thursday. In addition, Colombian police officers allegedly provided protection for the DEA agents' weapons and property during the parties, the report states. 10 DEA agents later admitted attending the parties, and some of the agents received suspensions of 2 to 10 days. Now, as I say, you may have seen that headline when it first came out, but let's do a little thought experiment today, because I think that if we understand history, we have a better idea of what's coming in the future. So to prove that point, let's just cogitate a little bit on this story, and let's imagine what you think ultimately came out of all of this. Let's just take a moment, make your prediction. What do you think ultimately came of this story? And, well, we'll see if that checks out or not. But before you make your prediction, let's just keep a few facts in mind, a few facts that might be relevant to this story. We'll start at the most mainstream of mainstream sources. We're not going to dip so far into the world of conspiracy here. We're looking at the British Library homepage, where they talk about the history of the British East India Company and its trade with China, which notes that tea imports soon became, in the 18th century that is, the largest single item in Britain's trading account. Conversely, the export to China of British and Indian goods began to decline, and trade imbalance between Britain and China occurred as a result. So the shortage of silver to pay for the tea imports forced the British to seek other commodities to compensate for the loss and to bring in profit, i.e. they were buying too much from China, they weren't selling enough to China, so they had to discover something that they could sell to China that China would buy in great quantities to get some of that silver back out of the inward-looking Middle Kingdom, and they discovered opium, a highly lucrative commodity. And of course, the British Library goes on to say that they were never directly involved in the sale of opium, but they were all opium selling was conducted through private agencies. So of course, that's the bit of the whitewash. But yes, the British East India Company back in the 18th century, basically opening up China with opium, which of course did lead to the First and Second Opium Wars of the mid-19th century that ultimately transformed China greatly and has continuing effects, really, I think, echoing down through the centuries. Well, one of the side effects of this, of course, is that one of the families that greatly profited from that opium trade was the Russell family, specifically Samuel Russell, who established Russell and Company in 1823 for the purpose of acquiring opium in Turkey and smuggling it to China. And Russell and Company merged with the Perkins Syndicate in 1830 to become the primary American opium smuggler. Many of the great American and European fortunes were built on the China opium trade. One of Russell and Company's chief of operations in Canton was Warren Delano Jr., grandfather of Franklin Roosevelt. Oh, that's interesting. Other Russell partners included John Cleve Green, who financed Princeton, Abiel Lowe, who financed construction of Columbia, Joseph Coolidge, and the Perkins, Sturgis, and Forbes families. Coolidge's son organized the United Fruit Company, and his grandson, Archibald C. Coolidge, was a co-founder of the Council on Foreign Relations. Surprise, surprise. And Samuel Russell's cousin, William Huntington Russell, went on to establish the Russell Trust, aka Skull and Bones. And if you've never actually looked into the Russell Trust Association, the official business name for the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, it is worth looking into, because it's a fascinating connection that goes, of course, into the realm of Prescott Bush and Brown Brothers Harriman and all of those kinds of connections, of course, fleshed out by Anthony Sutton in America's Secret Establishment, a must-read for anyone who hasn't done so. So, again, just a fascinating wealth of information there about how opium trade really did help finance and fund some of the ghouls that created some of the institutions that were down through the ages. But moving right along, people might also be familiar with the politics of heroin, which was initially the politics of heroin in Southeast Asia in its initial 1972 printing. It's now just the politics of heroin, CIA complicity in the global drug trade, which is a pretty remarkable statement, but it's backed up by Alfred McCoy, who is not just some amateur sleuther. He was an actual professor. He's an award-winning author. He's done some incredible research on how the CIA were complicit in helping to move the drugs around out of the Golden Triangle out into the global market, and especially during the Vietnam era. And let's just listen to a little bit of him describing that research that he did.
I was told by by American officials that the United States didn't mind that Air America aircraft were kind of carrying the opium out of the hills. Okay, it wasn't the best, but it was just opium. But they didn't like the idea that they would be complicit in moving the opium out of Longcheng into international commerce, because of course the main consumers of the processed opium into heroin were U.S. forces fighting in South Vietnam.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, not only was the CIA's Air America wholly covertly owned and operated by the CIA, of course, mainly responsible for trafficking the opium and heroin out of the region, but it turns out that yes, a lot of the heroin was making its way right into the U.S. Army, where Army medical officers in mid-1971 were estimating that 10 to 15% of lower-ranking enlisted men in Vietnam were heroin users. So they were helping to fund the morale destruction of their own troops. But all in a day's work for the CIA, I suppose. And of course, in the 1980s, we had some interesting things coming out of the Iran-Contra scandal, including some allegations reported on by Robert Perry and others that, oh yeah, well, it turns out that some of those Contras we were helping were also selling drugs in the United States, and we were kind of helping them, bringing the drugs in and sell them as a way to fund their operations. And that ultimately resulted in a report that was issued that was worked on in December 1988 and issued in 1989 by the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations entitled Drugs, Law Enforcement, and Foreign Policy, that found that, yes, indeed, there was a bit of that going on, and yes, the U.S. government was complicit in at least looking the other way while some of this trafficking went on. Who was the chairman of that Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations?
Were U.S. government officials aware of drug smuggling in and around the Contra movement? And did they simply choose to ignore it? One U.S. senator says, absolutely.
There's no question in my mind there is a complicity in the flow of drugs into this country, period.
Oh, that's right. John Skull and Bones Kerry. How appropriate that he was the ghoulish head of that subcommittee. That, yeah, of course, there's no question in my mind there was government complicity in the flow of drugs into this country. That, of course, John Kerry, who, of course, went on to become Secretary of State. Well, lovely, wonderful. Well, that's, again, the 1980s, but those charges resurfaced and were fleshed out in some degree more detail in the mid-1990s by none other than Gary Webb, who I really hope that my regular listeners are familiar with. He did the Dark Alliance series for the San Jose Mercury News. That was a groundbreaking series in so many different ways, one of which was that it was put up on the internet. It was the first major newspaper series ever to be published online as an ongoing series, and it has been archived by the narconews.com. I'll put the link, of course, as well as the links to all of these things in the show notes for this video, so that you please do check into that. But yes, this groundbreaking series fleshed out some of those charges, and in a nutshell, for those who haven't read the Dark Alliance book that was the ultimate product of this ongoing newspaper series, Gary Webb himself described it this way.
It's about a drug ring that operated in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the mid-'80s, and it was connected to a Nicaraguan anti-communist army called the FDN, which was one of the biggest groups that we know as the Contras, and it was selling cocaine in Los Angeles for the most part, but in other areas of the country as well, to the gangs, to the Crips and Bloods.
So, in a nutshell, yes, as part of the Iran-Contra affair, part of the Contra funding was coming from drug sales to Crips and Bloods and other gang groups, specifically in South Central LA was where a lot of this was happening. A lot of the cocaine was being shipped in through there and was ending up on the streets in the form of crack. And the crack revolution, the crack epidemic, the crack takeover of the 1980s, largely at the doorstep of this problem. And who is the FDN? Of course, one of the Contra groups that was being supported and to a certain extent controlled by the CIA at the time. So the CIA were complicit, again, in the findings of Gary Webb in various aiding and abetting of this through some of the people who were connected to this operation. And well, how did the mainstream press react to Gary Webb's reporting? Well, you had the brave and fearless reporters of the Washington Post and other outlets coming out immediately to say the CIA and crack evidence is lacking of alleged plot, and you had others at the LA Times and others just trying to destroy Gary Webb's credibility. Funnily enough, of course, in December of 1997, you had things like this U.S. DOJ special report, the Office of the Inspector General, coming out with a special report on the CIA Contra crack cocaine controversy, a review of the Justice Department's investigations and prosecutions, which basically finds that everything that Gary Webb was alleging was more or less correct. I mean, Blandon received the benefit of green card in a wholly improper manner. During a period of time in the 80s, the Justice Department was not certain whether it wanted to prosecute Menezes or use him as a cooperating witness to make cases against others. Part of the government was not anxious to have DEA agent Celi Castillo, openly probe the activities at Ilopango Airport because of sensitive covert operations there. The CIA did, in fact, intervene in the Zavala case and may have played a role in having a sum of money returned to him. Although these findings are troubling, they are a far cry from the type of broad manipulation and corruption of the federal justice system suggested by the original allegations. So although all of these things are true, in the whole, it doesn't really mean much, is basically what they were trying to say. But yes, they did ultimately find that all of the substance of the reporting was correct, as did even the CIA Inspector General admit to the House Committee on Intelligence in March 1998. As I said earlier, we have found no evidence in the course of this lengthy investigation of any conspiracy by CIA or its employees to bring drugs into the United States. However, during the Contra era, CIA worked with a variety of people to support the Contra program. These included CIA assets, pilots who ferried supplies to the Contras, as well as Contra officials and others. Let me be frank about what we are finding. There are instances where CIA did not, in an expeditious or consistent fashion, cut off relationships with individuals supporting the Contra program who were alleged to have engaged in drug trafficking activity or take action to resolve the allegations, i.e. they knew these people were shipping drugs into the country and they did nothing about it. That smells like CIA complicity to me. But it's no surprise that Gary Webb was ultimately a character assassinated and then presumably actually assassinated when he committed suicide. More on that in my Requiem for the Suicided episode of the podcast, but no real surprise when we find out years and years and years and years later, released July of 2014, this internal CIA report on public affairs and the drug conspiracy story, lauding the CIA Public Affairs Office for averting a major disaster in the Gary Webb case. So basically the CIA Public Affairs Office and its liaisons in the journalistic world basically helped to avert a crisis for the CIA. Interesting, isn't it? And it should be, because of course this points back to such things as Operation Mockingbird and all the times that we know of actual CIA complicity in actually employing people in the media. So again, this should be no surprise, but another piece of this puzzle. More pieces of this puzzle. You can go to Narco News, the Narcosphere, Bill Conroy's blog, where he had, for example, this January 2009 article with this excellent overview of all of the CIA drug planes that have gone down over the years, all of these planes that were registered to U.S. registrants and then mysteriously transferred just before, sometimes literally the day before, they went down, carrying hundreds of kilograms of cocaine in various places. So talking about April 2006 to DC-9, September 2007 to Gulfstream 2, talking about this other Skyway aircraft, Inc., Cessna, and some of these other aircraft. So again, a long history of CIA drug planes going down with hundreds of kilos of cocaine and other things. And just another example of all of this, of course, back in the 70s when Alfred McCoy was writing about it, of course, the Vietnam War and the Golden Triangle was the center of opium production, cultivation, harvesting, and processing. Well, now, of course, it's now Afghanistan. So we have the ongoing scandal in Afghanistan with the record poppy harvest after record poppy harvest, year after year after year after year. This year looking to be no different, because now, as I wrote about yesterday in the International Forecaster, actually today I suppose it comes out, according to farmers in poppy-rich Helmand and Kandahar provinces, these new seeds, new poppy seeds, appeared out of nowhere, delivered by the same drug traffickers who appear at the start of every season with their tools and fertilizer and farming advice and cash advances, and come back at the end of the season to collect the crop. And these new seeds are apparently better drug plants, requiring less water and having a faster growth time. So they've just appeared out of nowhere to make this presumably the best growing season ever. And of course, if people don't remember, you can please go to this article and watch Geraldo interviewing Lieutenant Colonel Brian Christmas of the U.S. Marines, admitting that the troops guard the poppies. So yes, and of course the State Department also explicitly refuses to deny that they ever had the goal of eradicating the poppy harvest on the U.S. invasion agenda for Afghanistan. Little side note for those who don't know, the invasion of Afghanistan was the first major security policy directive of the Bush administration and was sitting on the desk of President Bush waiting to be signed on September 4th, 2001, i.e. 1 week before 9/11. So just that little tidbit for you there. So anyway, all of this is to just a little bit of background on this drug story, just so you have some of these facts. And now let's make our prediction. What ultimately became of that DEA agent prostitute drug money scandal story? Well, the DEA sex party scandal just got worse. This from a couple of weeks ago from Reuters. U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration agents in Colombia were taking part in alleged sex parties with prostitutes funded by drug cartels years earlier than previously known, U.S. lawmakers said on Tuesday. Several DEA agents were taking part in these parties in Bogota as early as 2001, said a summary of a DEA report released by the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform at a hearing on the misconduct. This new internal report describes not one or two isolated incidents, but literally dozens of parties with prostitutes, Democratic Representative Elijah Cummings said at the hearing, where lawmakers grilled DEA Administrator Michelle Leonhardt. And it gets even worse, actually, if you go on to read in another DEA-related case. Kenya Michelle Banks, a former DEA program manager, pleaded guilty on Tuesday in Maryland to submitting dozens of fake credit card applications for fictitious DEA employees, defrauding the U.S. government of $113,000. But that's pretty small potatoes, I guess, when we're looking at the bigger issues going on here. So it gets even more ridiculous. So, as we mentioned before, 7 of the agents admitted to participating in these sex parties, and they received suspensions of 2 to 10 days, provoking this headline, this laughable headline from the New York Times, the paper of record: anger over reports of DEA agents' parties, and bewilderment at mild penalties. Bewilderment. How could this happen? I just can't understand how the DEA isn't interested in prosecuting this more harshly. But don't worry, because Attorney General Eric Holder Jr. issued a memo on Friday reminding employees of the department's firm stance against soliciting prostitutes, even in countries where it is legal. That's right. Don't worry, folks. DEA agents reminded not to attend sex parties paid for by drug cartels by our good friend, Attorney General Eric Holder. Well, that's all done and dusted, right? There we go. We'll just wipe our hands of it, and that's the issue done and resolved. Well, maybe not. One tiny, maybe bright ray of hope on the horizon. DEA chief to resign in wake of agency's Colombian sex scandal. Scum scandal is probably the better way of putting it. Yes, DEA chief Michelle Leonhardt is looking like she is going to resign her post as a result of this. Well, that is one tiny little ray of hope to come out of all of this. But does it make any difference whatsoever to this centuries-long, but at the very least, when we're looking specifically in this U.S. government actively aiding and participating in the drug trade, at least documentably half a century-long relationship, is this resignation going to make any difference whatsoever? Hint, no, it is not. I hope you passed the test, friends. It's an interesting